Hello, I'm Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to talk about the populist movement in the 1890s and a wave of political changes facing the United States in that same decade that drastically set the stage for the turn of the century in 1900 and the later founding of the progressive movement that dominates the first 2 decades of the 1900s. So, without further ado, let's jump in and talk about a group that starts to get overlooked in all of the discussions that we've had in the post-Civil War U.S. history about the Second Industrial Revolution. We haven't talked too much about farmers and the agricultural sector. Farmers still make up the vast majority of American workers in the late 1800s, and they're experiencing a bit of a hard time in the 1890s, partly because, as we've mentioned previously, agricultural workers are competing not only against other farmers who live in their region or their area, but also farmers across the United States and across the globe because of advances in shipping technology. Now your product is competing on a truly global marketplace. And at Economics 101, when we talk about capitalism and prices, the more you have of a supply, generally the lower the prices drop. And we particularly see this in two agricultural products in the United States: cotton and wheat. Cotton, which is still predominantly grown in the south of the United States, had tumbled in value from 11 cents a bushel in 1881 to about 4.5 cents a bushel in 1894. Wheat, which is heavily grown in the West, really was struggling with not only low prices, but also high startup costs. For example, agricultural equipment was expensive, and so many farmers had to take out loans to pay for this agricultural equipment to help process and harvest wheat. And then there's also the very high prices being charged to farmers by railroad companies to ship their products to market. So the populist movement comes out of a group called the Farmers Alliance, which is founded in Texas in the 1870s to help farmers by working together. The idea of the Farmers Alliance was that farmers would help each other through cooperative financing and marketing, allowing them to work together and negotiate better rates, to get things like loans and negotiate better prices on their products that they were selling. But very quickly, the people who belonged to the Farmers Alliance realized that there was only so much they could accomplish in the private sector. And they eventually ended up proposing that the federal government set up a system which would allow farmers to store their goods in warehouses and use them as collateral to get loans, what they envisioned as subsidized or low cost loans from the federal government. And this was an idea that was dubbed the Sub Treasury Plan. So once the Farmers Alliance realizes that ideally they're going to need to involve the government more in achieving this desire to help farmers, they've officially morphed into a political party dubbed the People's Party. Even though nobody really calls them the People's Party, everyone calls them by their more popular nickname, the Populists. The Populist Party appeals not only to farmers, who were the origins of this political party, but also they wanted to reach out to industrial workers. They realized that there was wisdom in aligning farmers and industrial workers, many of whom had some of the same complaints in terms of who the economy was set up to benefit, i.e., elite folks and big business in the 1890s. And the Populists built off of the existing organizational structure of the Farmers Alliance network to mobilize people to vote. And because they're sort of building off of the existing framework of the Farmers Alliance, the party had the most power in Western states where there was more of a concentration of farmers. The first official Populist Party platform, published in 1892, had a whole bunch of items that the Populist Party wanted to address. Particularly, the big idea of the Populist Party was they felt that the federal government should regulate modern industry and transportation for the public good. They made the argument that big business had gotten too big, it was harmful to consumers and the public. They also made an argument about the levels of political corruption that were notorious during the Gilded Age, and argued that one of the other main goals of the Populist Party was to restore the democracy of the people by removing political corruption. And so, in support of these two big goals, the idea the federal government needs to regulate the economy more for the good of the public, and also we need to address this idea of political corruption so people have more of a voice in government. There's a whole bunch of different proposals to accomplish these goals. One proposal was the direct election of senators, because according to the original Constitution, senators were appointed rather than directly elected by people. They wanted the government to issue currency, which the government had only done sporadically, usually during times of necessity, like during the Civil War with the issuance of greenbacks. Standardized income tax to better fund the federal government, because, again, we had seen income taxes occasionally when they were necessary, again during the Civil War, but there was no permanent income tax on either people or corporations yet. They wanted low-cost loans for farmers to better be able to get equipment necessary to be competitive in the global market. And they also provided for the rights of workers to unionize and advocate for better working conditions. So because of this, the populists are trying to not only draw on farmers, but with that last part of the platform, industrial workers. So the populists have a very broad appeal to a bunch of different groups of people. One group is minorities. The populists try to appeal to farmers of color who live throughout the South. They argued that most of the goals of the party would be better accomplished by sheer numbers. They didn't want to discriminate against minorities. But in the South, it was very difficult for populists to get support at the ballot box because of the populists recognizing the shared plight of all farmers, regardless of their skin color. Many Southern white voters saw them as untouchable, basically, because a lot of white Southerners still bought into this idea of white supremacy and really did not like to vote for any organization that advocated for more rights or privileges for African Americans or other minorities. The populists also appealed to women by supporting the idea of women's suffrage or women's right to vote. Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was a homesteader and a lawyer, was one of the more active female Populist Party members. Populists, in supporting the idea of women voting, again, makes a huge political impact on Western states where the Populist Party is the strongest. And it's part of this reason why the very first states to grant women the right to vote in elections are states in the West, like Colorado, like Idaho. And then lastly, the biggest block of voters that the Populist Party was looking to win over were industrial workers. They particularly saw all of this violence that had been directed towards striking workers and union members that we'd previously talked about as being an opportunity for the populists to address the concerns that workers had about this increasing level of power of private business over the lives of their workforce. The difficulty in appealing to industrial workers, though, is the culture is very different between the farmers of the Populist Party and the urban industrial workers. The main goals of the populists were still very heavily centered around things of interest to farmers, like regulating rail prices and getting the government to subsidize loans for farm equipment. And then there was also the issue of the fact that many of these urban workers were Jewish or Catholic, a lot of these farmers were Protestant, and many populist rallies almost kind of took on an element of old school religious revivalism, and that was a completely alien concept if you're not Protestant. And so there was a cultural clash. Like, people who were part of this industrial workforce in cities went to these meetings, and it just seemed like a really weird vibe to them. And so there's always more of a limit of how welcoming the Populist Party can be culture wise to these industrial workers. And so more and more workers end up siding with the Republican Party in the 1890s, even though the party is most associated with big business, because the Republican Party is also associated with the support of a tariff or a higher import tax to protect American producers and therefore American jobs. The big campaign of 1896 puts the Populist Party on the political map in the United States, particularly because the Populist Party forms an alliance with the Democratic Party, and they unite together behind a single candidate, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, this will not be the last time in American history he is mentioned or discussed. William Jennings Bryan really tries to bridge the gap between farmers and urban workers, but he still centers agricultural workers because that's the heart of the Populist Party. He particularly talks about the importance of agriculture to an integrated national economy. He, in his most famous speech, the Cross of Gold speech, talks about the currency debate in the United States and takes the side of farmers and the working class by advocating for the use of silver currency, which would increase monetary supply and aid workers. Because the thought was the more currency you have, the higher the price on commodities, and therefore the more profit for people like farmers. So, in talking about the ideas floated by the Republican Party to embrace instead the gold standard to kind of restrict the value of the dollar by only pegging it to gold, in his most famous quote in that speech, he declared, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." When it came to his background, Bryan lives up to the street cred of supporting the working class. He's also a member of the social gospel movement, which you'll remember is the movement among both Protestant and Catholic Christians to support the less fortunate in society, both by giving them aid directly, but also by advocating for laws to better protect them. Bryan's opponent is William McKinley of the Republican Party. McKinley emphasized that the gold standard, even though it was unpopular among workers, would strengthen not only the American dollar, but also help American business. The election of 1896 is considered the first modern election in United States politics, mostly due to the amount of money spent on the campaign. Not adjusted for inflation. So in other words, we're talking about the value of money in the 1890s. McKinley spent about $10 million on his campaign in comparison to Bryan's $300,000. And again, that's not adjusted in today's money. Today's money would be considerably more than that. The election is a close one. In the popular vote, Bryan and McKinley are fairly close. However, remember, in the United States, it's not the popular vote that determines the outcome of the election, but instead, it's the Electoral College vote that determines who becomes president. Because Republicans dominated the more populous states, they got more Electoral College votes, and therefore McKinley won. William McKinley's election to the presidency signals a new era within the United States, particularly in presidential politics. Before this, since the Civil War, we had had about 30 years of back and forth power struggle between the Republican and the Democratic Party, a lot of one-term presidents, a lot of turnover in political power at the national level. And now we see a shift in McKinley in favor of the Republican Party, which was not only supported by big business in the election of 1896, but also by workers who saw McKinley as a candidate who would support and protect American industry, aka their employers. And once McKinley gets into office in early 1897, the Republicans do pass the Gold Standard Act of 1900, officially pegging the value of the US dollar to the value of gold. And then they also pass a higher tariff. So they raise the tax on imported products with the Dingley Tariff of 1897.